In the last video, we got our application working, but there's one quick little improvement that I want to make to our user header component. Now this is a very small thing, and it's going to appear really small in this case, but it's something that over time, as you start to work on more complicated applications, is going to become more and more useful. All right, so let me show you what it is. Inside of our user header component, we are passing this thing a collection of different props. Right now, this thing gets access to the user ID, and it also gets access to the entire list of users. Now, I want to point out something here really quickly. The user header component is not really well suited to take the entire array of users. That might sound like a really weird thing to say, but essentially the entire purpose of the user header component is to show one singular user on the screen. It only has to show one user, but we are giving it way more data than it ever needs. We are giving it the entire list of users. And so to make this component by itself, like just this class right here, a little bit more reusable, I think that it would be a lot better if we could figure out some way to pass it just the user that it cares about, like maybe the ID that it cares about and the user that it cares about, but definitely not the big array. So to do so, there's a couple of different approaches we could take. We could either get our entire list of users inside a post list, and then every single time that we render the user header right here, we could go through that find logic and attempt to just pass in the user that we care about as opposed to this user ID. But I want to show you one other approach that we could take. Back inside of my user header component, I'm going to go down to the MapStateToProps function. All right, MapStateToProps right here. Now you might notice that this MapStateToProps function seems just like a little bit unnecessary, right? Like every time we want to pull some data out of a component, we have to define this really repetitive function and then have to build up this object right here that gets some data out of our Redux store. Another way that would have been really nice to pull data out of the Redux store, then have to define this whole function. You can't do this, to be clear. You can't do this. What I'm about to show you is not valid, but it would have been nice if we could just like pass in a string of something like users like so. And then just say that connect should understand that we want to pull the users property off the state object and pass it into our component as a prop called users. Right? That would have been kind of cool if we could have just done that. But instead, we have to go through this really long definition of MapStateToProps. So it turns out that there's actually kind of a reason for that. The reason that we define MapStateToProps right here is so that we can do kind of like these pre-calculations on values that are coming into our component as props and our Redux state. So rather than passing in like a ton of data to our component and relying upon the component to figure out how to find the user that we care about, we could instead extract all that logic to the MapStateToProps function. So rather than going through this find operation inside the component itself, write that logic out inside of MapStateToProps. Now, like I said, that probably sounds like a very, very small distinction. I just told you 2 seconds ago, yeah, it'd be nice to make this component more reusable, and it would be more reusable if we did not have to pass it the entire list of users. But then as the solution, I'm saying that we're basically just going to relocate that logic to a couple lines down inside this file. And so it might sound like that's no increase in reusability at all. Well, let me tell you why this kind of technically is an increase in reusability. It turns out that in some applications, like some professional applications, some engineers decide to define this MapStateToProps function and this connect stuff right here inside of a separate file. So you might have one file that has MapStateToProps and the initial connect setup right here, and then in a different file, you will define the component by itself. The advantage to that is that you'll have a component that can be used on its own without having to reach into the Redux store by going through all this work right here. But then if you want to, you can also very easily create a version of that component that will reach into the Redux store and get all of its own data. In addition, if you ever have another component that needs to get access to, say, just one particular user, given only a user ID, we could easily write MapStateToProps and this connect stuff into a separate file and then reuse it in multiple components inside of our application. So like I said, it probably doesn't seem like this is going to be any increase in reusability of our component, but in the long run, in some applications, you're going to find that this is kind of a common pattern to extract a lot of logic into MapStateToProps. Okay, so enough talking. I think you probably get the idea. So essentially, rather than finding the appropriate user inside of our component, we want to find the appropriate user inside of MapStateToProps. So to do so, I'm going to remove this find statement right here entirely. We're going to replace it in just a second, and we're going to instead place the find statement inside of MapStateToProps. So I will say state.users.find, and then for every user inside there, I want to look at the user ID and compare it to, oh, wait. Oh, that's a little bit of an issue. Right here, we want to find a user ID that is equal to this component's prop of user ID. But that prop is only available inside that component. We can't get access to it inside of MapStateToProps. Or can we? Well, it turns out we can. So MapStateToProps does not only get called with our state object out of our Redux store as an argument. It actually gets a second argument as well that is referred to as ownProps. This ownProps object right here is a copy, not actually a copy, it is a reference to the props that are about to be sent into this component right here. So if we ever want to do some of these like pre-calculation steps so that we don't have to pass in a ton of data directly to the component, we can reference the props that are about to go into the component on this object right here, and then we still get our Redux state on the first argument. So essentially, we're going to compare user.id with ownProps.userID like so. And that's pretty much it. Well, actually just a little bit more. That's going to find the appropriate user. We don't really want to assign that to a property called users anymore. We probably want to assign that to a property called user, so I'll update that. And then finally, inside my render method, we no longer have access to the this.props.users value. Instead, it's simply this.props.user, singular, because now we are only passing in the one user that we care about to our component. So inside my render method, I'm going to destructure off just that user from my props object. And so now we can check to see if that user exists. If they don't, we'll return null and show nothing on the screen, but if they do, we'll show their name inside that div. Okay, so again, the entire idea here is that we can extract anything that is going to do some computation on our state, our Redux state, and the props coming into our component to the MapStateToProps function. And that's really what MapStateToProps is for. All right, so let's save this. And then we'll test it out really quickly and just make sure that everything still works. And it looks like, yep, it does. I still see all of my authors on here. Okay, so that's a good refactor. Now we'll take a quick pause right here. When we come back to the next section, remember I'd said very mysteriously that there's still a little bit of a problem inside of our app. So let's take a quick pause, come back to the next video, and I'll show you exactly what that problem is.